Over the years, a person gains not only life experience, but also a desire to surround their grandchildren with unconditional love and care. Grandparents eagerly share joyful moments in their lives, offer support in difficult times, and strive to be there, giving warmth and heartfelt participation. However, as the ancient wisdom says, balance is important in everything. Excessive love and forgiveness can lead to the loss of the very value that the older generation seeks to instill. When misdeeds are not given importance, the boundaries of what is permissible become blurred, and with them, respect disappears. Even those closest to you should not be treated with limitless tolerance, allowing them to disregard personal boundaries and emotional balance. Not every wish of grandchildren should be satisfied, especially if it harms feelings and self-esteem. Unfortunately, elderly people often find themselves in a situation where their kindness and care are taken for granted. Yesterday's child, mesmerized by bedtime stories, can turn into a cold and distant adult. How can you maintain closeness and respect without losing your own dignity? Next, we will consider real stories of elderly people who have faced similar problems. We will talk about behavioral errors that lead to the loss of authority and respectful attitude from grandchildren, as well as how to avoid such situations. Tatiana Petrovna has always been distinguished by extraordinary warmth and cordiality towards others, but these qualities were especially evident in her role as a grandmother. With the birth of her grandson Dima, she devoted herself entirely to caring for him, showering him with boundless love, inexhaustible patience, and heartfelt kindness. Without knowing fatigue, she supported her daughter, happily babysat her grandson, immersed him in the world of fairy tales, and willingly accompanied him to school. Dima, in turn, responded with sincere affection, willingly sharing his achievements and joyful moments. During periods of grief and failure, he instinctively sought protection behind her back, confident that his grandmother would not reproach him, but would certainly comfort and support him. It was to her that he turned for emotional warmth in moments of sadness and sorrow. However, relentless time made its adjustments. As Dima grew up, his teenage hobbies, new friends, and the all-consuming world of gadgets gradually pushed his grandmother into the background. She continued to be there, but increasingly noticed that her presence no longer evoked the same reverent response. At first, her visits became less frequent, then her answers to phone calls became short and devoid of the former warmth. Once, when visiting, Tatiana Petrovna heard from her grandson only a fleeting "hi" thrown in passing, without the slightest eye contact. Then she tried not to attach much importance to it, blaming it on fatigue. But later, when the long-awaited meeting finally took place, she saw before her as if a stranger, cold, distant, and irritated. The culmination of the painful estrangement was an episode that occurred on her daughter's birthday. Tatiana Petrovna, as always with love, handed her grandson a plate of his favorite homemade cutlets, but in response heard a stinging, "Grandma, no need, I'll take it myself." Laughter swept through the table, but something irretrievably broke in the woman's heart at that moment. She, as always, restrainedly and with dignity, smiled, trying not to betray her pain, but returning home, she was haunted by a depressing feeling of emptiness. Having failed to stop bad behavior in time, many representatives of the older generation face similar problems. They suffer, look for excuses for the actions of loved ones, and harbor illusions about future changes. However, the reality is that if clear boundaries of what is permissible were not established from the very beginning, then defining them later becomes a much more difficult task. Of course, children grow up, their interests change, but respect is a category that does not depend on age. It is the fruit of upbringing, the process of formation of which begins in early childhood. If a child is not taught from an early age to respect elders, then in adulthood one should not expect different behavior from him. And if suddenly a grandson allows himself an irritated tone, even fleetingly, it should not be ignored. It is necessary to calmly but firmly make it clear that such treatment is unacceptable. After all, by not asserting your rights today, you may face the fact that tomorrow he will lose respect not only for you, but also for those who sincerely love and care for him. At the same time, not only coldness or rudeness can destroy the connection between generations. Often, grandchildren, sometimes without even realizing it, begin to perceive the love and care of a grandmother as a kind of resource, always available and convenient to use. Manipulation is one of the most painful and insidious forms of relationship distortion that elderly people often encounter. Recognizing such behavior in its early stages can be challenging. Behind the outward display of warmth and affectionate words lies a subtle calculation, and if the true intentions are not recognized in time, the consequences can be extremely negative. When genuine care gives way to a desire for convenience, when love turns into a means to achieve personal goals, the heart that has given itself completely experiences profound disappointment. Maria Semyonovna, who had lived a long life, was a model of a kind and sympathetic grandmother. Despite living alone, she did not feel abandoned. Her granddaughter, Katya, had been persistent in achieving her desires since childhood and eventually realized that her grandmother was the most accommodating person in her environment, which became a very convenient circumstance for her. When her mother refused something, Katya would turn to her grandmother with a sad voice, begging for what she wanted. "Please, Grandma, Mom just doesn't understand my wishes." At first, her requests seemed harmless: toys, then exquisite clothes, and later money for entertainment. Katya did not commit reprehensible acts. She merely skillfully manipulated words to get her way. Although her grandmother sometimes suspected her granddaughter of some cunning, she still gave in, believing that these were just minor trifles. However, one day, accidentally overhearing Katya's phone conversation, Maria Semyonovna faced a harsh truth. "Don't worry, I'll take it from Grandma. She'll give it anyway. I just need to complain a little," she heard. These words touched her to the core. There was no warmth or gratitude in them, only cold calculation. For a long time, Maria Semyonovna pondered whether to raise this issue, justifying everything with youthful recklessness. But one day, hearing another request, she gathered her courage and replied differently. "Katenka, we need to talk. Help is not an obligation, but a voluntary choice," she said, calmly but firmly. Katya laughed at first, then frowned. "Grandma, what's wrong with you? I just asked." Maria Semyonovna uttered a phrase full of wisdom and bitterness. "I have tender feelings for you, but true love is not a one-way street, where one only gives and the other only receives." After these words, Katya left the room in irritation, leaving the elderly woman alone with painful reflections. Unfortunately, such behavior is common among many older people. They tend to be patient, afraid of causing offense, and strive to avoid conflicts. However, it is worth remembering that manipulation, if not stopped at the very beginning, tends to quickly take root and turn into a stable habit, shaping character. A child who has learned a pattern of behavior in which the desired is achieved through cunning is very likely to transfer this strategy to adult relationships. Such a person will subconsciously look for partners who can be controlled, not paying attention to the emotional pain that this may cause. If you notice that a grandson or granddaughter is trying to play on your feelings, saying words that you like to hear, but behind this lies a hidden selfish motive, you should not keep silent about the problem. It is important to avoid quarrels, reproaches, and dramatic scenes. Instead, you should directly and calmly explain that sincerity and mutual respect are the foundation of true feelings, and not a game in which one side always wins. If you do not set clear boundaries in time, a grandson or granddaughter may not only continue to manipulate, but may also stop noticing your presence in their life altogether. Indifference poses a serious threat to the emotional connection between generations when communication becomes optional for the younger generation and sometimes even burdensome. There is not always malicious intent behind such an attitude, but the result, understatement and blurred life guidelines, can be very sad. Galina Ivanovna often repeated that her grandchildren were the quintessence of her life's joy. She dedicated her days to them, enthusiastically creating culinary masterpieces in the form of their favorite pies, carefully knitting warm sweaters, and generously showering them with gifts, without waiting for special dates, striving to invest the depth of her love in these simple but meaningful expressions of attention. She felt a special closeness to her youngest grandson, Sasha. In his childhood, he was a real ray of light in her life, eagerly running to her to share fresh news, proudly showing off his school achievements and crafts. His eyes sparkled with happiness when he heard her affectionate invitation. "Come to me. I'm always happy to see you." Galina Ivanovna felt needed, surrounded by love, and this feeling filled her existence with deep meaning. However, relentless time made its adjustments. Over the years, Sasha visited his grandmother less and less, and then stopped answering her phone calls altogether. At some point, she bitterly realized that his presence hadn't brightened her home for many months. Longing and worry tormented her heart, but she was afraid of seeming intrusive. And then, when Sasha urgently needed money, he suddenly remembered his grandmother. He called her, speaking in a soft, heartfelt voice, unexpectedly inquiring about her well-being with warmth. This long-awaited call, however, hit her like an icy blast. It turned out that he only remembered her when he desperately needed help. At that moment, Sasha was driven by only one thing: the opportunity to get what he wanted. Galina Ivanovna, despite the bitterness that overwhelmed her, couldn't refuse her beloved grandson. Her heart was still filled with love for him, even with the realization that the image of his grandmother only surfaced in his memory in moments of need and self-interest. A few days later, a plan was born in her mind, simple but full of deep meaning. She decided to test the strength of their bond. If she refrained from making the first move, would he take the initiative? Week after week passed, but the airwaves were silent. A month went by, and there was no sound from Sasha. It was at that moment that a sharp, knife-like thought pierced her heart. She had ceased to be a close person to him, turning into a convenient resource, a source of help, something reliable, but devoid of true value. This harsh truth, like a cold shower, awakened her. Episodes flashed in her memory when his appearance was solely related to needs, financial support, moral support. Before, she found excuses in his busyness, youth, lack of time. Now the veil had lifted. It wasn't a time crunch, but an ingrained habit of taking her care for granted, something self-evident. When Sasha once again asked for help, Galina Ivanovna, summoning all her willpower, refused for the first time. In response, he simply said, "Okay," and ended the conversation. After that, there was a long silence that stretched for months. For her, this became irrefutable proof. He wasn't looking for emotional warmth, but personal gain. Yes, it hurt, but now she had knowledge, and knowledge, as they say, is power. Such situations, unfortunately, are not uncommon in the lives of elderly people. Their love and care are valued only as long as they are useful. Sometimes the roots of grandchildren's alienation lie not in their personal ingratitude, but in the atmosphere that has been cultivated in the family since childhood. A child who is used to unconditional care doesn't always realize the need to give something in return. How do you change this situation? First of all, it's necessary to clearly define your boundaries. If a grandson's visits are motivated only by need, it's worth saying no firmly once and watching his reaction. It's equally important to openly express your feelings, avoiding reproaches and grievances. A calm and sincere admission. I value your interest in my life. I want to feel that our communication is valuable to you, not only in difficult moments, can have much more impact than endless lectures. After all, grandchildren grow up, and the relationships they build with loved ones shape their personality for life. By learning to respect and value their family, they will be able to show respect to other people, making the world around them kinder and brighter. But what if the problem goes beyond simple indifference? What if grandchildren lose touch not only with their grandmother, but with the whole family, perceiving loved ones as an insignificant background that can be ignored, when family traditions seem to them something outdated and meaningless? Neglecting family values is another serious problem that destroys the connection between generations and leads to deep alienation. Lydia Vasilyevna was the true soul of the family around which the whole home world was built. She tirelessly strengthened unity between relatives. Every year she gathered all her loved ones at the New Year's table, creating an atmosphere of warmth and joy. For Easter, she baked Easter cakes herself, strictly following the old recipe she inherited from her grandmother, thus continuing the culinary traditions of her ancestors. On the birthdays of each family member, she cooked their favorite dishes, showing care and attention to their preferences. Lydia Vasilyevna carefully kept old photo albums, like a treasury of memories, and happily shared these stories with her grandchildren, passing on to them the precious connection between generations. When her grandson was still a child, he took great pleasure in participating in all these family customs. He listened with bated breath to stories about his grandmother's youth, looked with interest at the yellowed photographs, and laughed heartily at funny incidents from the past. However, time marched relentlessly forward, and the boy gradually grew up. He began to appear at family gatherings less and less often, initially explaining it with his workload at school, then with a busy work schedule, and then stopped responding to invitations altogether. Once again, hearing an invitation to a family celebration from his grandmother, he wearily said, "Grandma, I really don't have time for this right now. Who even needs these outdated traditions?" These words, like a sharp knife, pierced her heart. Everything she had so carefully cherished and preserved turned out to be completely unnecessary and unimportant to her grandson. A feeling of deep sadness and disappointment overwhelmed her, like winter cold. Lydia Vasilyevna, however, did not give in to despair and did not stop trying to establish contact with her grandson, did not shut herself off from him with a wall of resentment. Contrary to expectations, she abandoned reproaches, choosing a different path to his heart. One day, when her grandson visited her, she, trying not to attract attention, took an old photo album from the closet and opened it in front of him, as if by chance. "Look, this is your mother as a child, and here you are, with eyes like your grandfather's." At first the young man tried to wave it off, showing reluctance, but suddenly his gaze lingered on one of the pictures, evoking vague memories. "Where are we?" "It seems like this is the same park where we fed the ducks," he said with some surprise. Lydia Vasilyevna smiled kindly in response. "Yes, you were so happy then." And suddenly, lost in thought, he quietly added, "And do you remember how we made a snowman together in the yard?" This fleeting memory became the first ray of hope for the return of their former closeness. Sometimes just a light touch to the past is enough to awaken dormant feelings. Children and grandchildren, carried away by the rapid pace of modern life, sometimes forget about the immutable importance of family roots. It often seems to them that meetings with relatives, heartfelt conversations, and observing traditions can be painlessly postponed to an indefinite later, not realizing that this later may never come, and therefore every reminder of a rich family history is an invaluable opportunity to preserve something much more significant than just family ties. This is a unique way to pass on from generation to generation the love, wisdom, warmth, and light that will continue to warm the hearts of descendants. If the younger generation is not reminded of the enduring value of family ties, there is a real risk of their irretrievable loss. However, restoring harmony in relations between generations is a task that requires not reproaches and instructions, but a tactful and heartfelt approach. It is important to revive bright moments of the past in memory, share memorable stories, and unobtrusively invite communication. Even if grandchildren do not show enthusiasm at first, the seeds of love and attention sown today will certainly sprout in the future. Sooner or later, they will realize that family is not just a formal association, but the foundation of their personality, a source of meaning and life stability. Unfortunately, there are cases when alienation is caused not only by a loss of interest in family values. Sometimes grandchildren begin to see grandmothers only as a source of material support, convenient and reliable, but devoid of spiritual value. Financial dependence and exploitation of elderly relatives for selfish purposes is another destructive problem that undermines trust and turns warm relationships into cold calculation. The story of Maria Sergeyevna, who worked as a teacher all her life and lived modestly but honestly, is a sad example. Even in retirement, she considered it her duty to help her family. Her grandson Andrei knew about his grandmother's kindness and responsiveness since childhood. In childhood, she pleased him with toys and clothes, and later began to give money for pocket expenses. At first, requests for help were infrequent, but over time they became regular. "Grandma, the salary is delayed. Can you lend me some?" he asked. Maria Sergeyevna, without hesitation, gave away her savings. Then new reasons appeared: textbooks, car repairs. She sincerely believed that her help was beneficial and doing good. One day, lost in thought, Maria Sergeyevna came to an unexpected discovery. Her grandson Andrei turned to her almost exclusively with requests for help. If she tried to start a normal conversation, inquire about his life, he could not contact her for weeks. Then she decided to conduct an experiment and see what would happen if she stopped offering her help first. Time passed, and as expected, Andrei did not appear. But then one day there was a call, and an excited voice sounded in the receiver. "Grandma, I urgently need money." And then Maria Sergeyevna, gathering her courage, said no for the first time. A tense silence hung on the phone, which was broken by an irritated question. "Why?" "Because I want you to come to me not only when you need money," she replied calmly. Andrei sighed heavily and, throwing, "Okay, I'll figure it out myself," disappeared from her life. Weeks dragged on, bringing no news. For Maria Sergeyevna, it was a painful but important realization. She was not a close person to her grandson, but merely a means to an end. And although it was difficult for her to accept this bitter truth, she gained inner clarity. Many elderly people are afraid to refuse their loved ones, fearing to lose their favor, but true care cannot be built on the fear of being rejected. Help should be conscious and voluntary, and relationships should be mutual and equal. If a person remembers you only in times of need, it is not a manifestation of care, but a banal exploitation. To maintain a sense of self-worth and maintain respectful relationships, it is extremely important to set personal boundaries in a timely manner, delicately but firmly conveying to others the idea that providing support is an act of goodwill, not a submissive duty. Material dependence is only one aspect of possible devaluation. Often, a much deeper wound is inflicted not by the request for financial assistance itself, but by the complete lack of gratitude in response to the care and attention shown. This feeling is well known to many members of the older generation. For example, Vera Nikolaevna always sincerely believed that true happiness lies in the feeling that you are remembered and cared for. She did not have high expectations, content with little. A few warm words, a phone call, made not for a formal reason, but simply out of a sincere desire to communicate. For many years, she lovingly cared for her grandson, starting from his infancy. She personally baked fragrant pies, knitted warm socks, and sent all kinds of treats. For her, all these actions were not just formal gestures, but a real language of love, a way of expressing the most tender feelings. In his early years, her grandson accepted her signs of attention with genuine pleasure, but over time, something subtly changed in their relationship. Phone calls became increasingly rare, and meetings became formal. Vera Nikolaevna increasingly took the initiative, sending messages first with the question, "How are you?" in response to which she received a dry and laconic, "Everything is fine, Grandma." And sometimes there was no answer at all. The culmination of the alienation came when Vera Nikolaevna decided to give her grandson a birthday present, a warm woolen scarf lovingly knitted by her hands, with tenderness and care invested in it. The grandson, accepting the gift, did not even bother to unwrap the package, saying in an indifferent tone, "Oh, Grandma, you shouldn't have. I didn't ask you to." These words hurt her much more than any open quarrel or rude attack. She just smiled weakly in response, trying not to show her resentment. At that moment, he rejected not just a material gift, but above all the love and care that had been invested in it. And although everything looked calm and restrained on the outside, for her this episode became a painful break in the emotional connection, a symbol of the onset of alienation. In such life vicissitudes, it is extremely important to avoid self-isolation and not allow resentment to erect an impregnable wall between people. Of course, the feeling of neglect hurts, but the irreparable loss of the opportunity to restore relations causes even greater pain. That is why it is necessary to openly express your feelings, avoiding reproaches and filling words with heartfelt warmth. A phrase spoken with sincerity. "It would give me great joy if you occasionally showed interest in my life, not out of a sense of duty, but out of love for me," is able to open hearts much more effectively than heartfelt messages. Grandchildren, growing up and gaining independence, forever retain the lessons taught by grandparents. If these lessons are imbued with respect, gratitude, and attention, they will certainly pass them on to the next generations. Thus, the warm thread connecting generations will not be interrupted, but will continue its touching journey from heart to heart. That evening, Vera Nikolaevna could not sleep for a long time, tormented by her grandson's words. "I didn't ask you to." They echoed in her mind like a heavy chord, leading to a bitter realization. Her care was perceived as something self-evident, as something that was due, not requiring an expression of gratitude. She decided to stop imposing herself, not to take the initiative in communication. The following weeks of silence, during which her grandson made no attempt to get closer, convinced Vera Nikolaevna that despite years of generous care, she had failed to instill a sense of gratitude in her grandson. She did not expect material gifts. She only needed a little attention and a kind word. However, gratitude is not just a manifestation of politeness, but a deep ability to appreciate the care of another person. If this quality isn't nurtured from childhood, a person will continue to perceive the love of their relatives as an inexhaustible resource, rather than a sincere expression of the soul, even in adulthood. The woman was lost in thought, trying to understand who had instilled such an attitude in her grandson. Why didn't he realize that showing care requires reciprocity and emotional warmth? The answer came to her. The example set by their parents has a huge impact on how grandchildren perceive their grandparents, in a situation where there is no respect. For elders in the family, a child is deprived of the opportunity to learn this important life lesson. They simply don't realize there's a flaw in their behavior until it's too late. Parents act as guides to moral values, keepers of traditions, and the culture of relationships. If they don't demonstrate through their own actions how valuable it is to respect and appreciate the older generation, the child develops a completely different behavioral model. In one family, the mother didn't consider it necessary to explain to her son how important the connection with his grandmother was. From early childhood, the boy showed indifference to her calls and wasn't interested in her life. The mother, absorbed in her own concerns, didn't interfere, assuming that everything would eventually sort itself out. However, the relationship between grandmother and grandson gradually cooled. He stopped visiting her, calls became less frequent, and meetings became formal and soulless. The grandmother, who had invested all her love and soul into raising him, received neither attention nor basic gratitude in return. Only with the passage of years did he realize that while others enjoyed a close, emotional connection with their grandmothers, his own relationship was marked by coldness and detachment. He felt awkward in their presence, not understanding how to show the warmth and care he had once taken for granted. The reason lay in the missed lessons of childhood. The mother hadn't emphasized the importance of family ties and hadn't demonstrated through her own example how to build relationships with elderly relatives. For the boy, this became an unspoken norm. His grandmother occupied a secondary place in his life because that was her perceived role according to his parents. Therein lies a profound truth. Respect doesn't arise on its own. It's the result of upbringing. If parents don't demonstrate the value of communication with the older generation, children grow up believing that elderly people are something insignificant. This behavioral model is passed down from generation to generation, and only parents can show their children that the elderly are a source of wisdom, love, and life experience, not just a familiar figure in the background. The conclusion is obvious. Respect for elders must be instilled from an early age through words, actions, and personal example. Parents should not only talk about love for their relatives, but also show it in practice, actively participate in family gatherings, and maintain connections. This is the living connection between generations. Only in this way can we preserve the culture of gratitude and respect in the future. It is adults who determine what their children's relationships with their grandparents will be like. This is their area of responsibility and conscious choice. Cultivating sensitivity, responsiveness, and an awareness of the inextricable connection with grandparents in the younger generation is not just following traditions, but also joining a priceless spiritual heritage that requires special attention. True respect for elders doesn't arise from a sense of compulsion or duty. It grows from deep love, sincere care, and genuine gratitude, which we instill in our children every day. In the whirlwind of everyday worries, it's important not to lose sight of this. Providing support and showing care for the older generation is a solid foundation on which the well-being of the family, and consequently our common happiness, is based.